Have you ever tried learning a language and been really motivated in the beginning, just to later give up when you aren't making the kind of progress you were hoping for? Having learned 4 languages to fluency by myself, I've realized the thing that separates the successful from the unsuccessful language learners are their habits. And they can either make or break your learning, and be the reason you reach all your goals, or be what holds you back from making any progress at all, causing you to waste years of time making some all too common mistakes. But what are these habits separating the successful language learners from the unsuccessful ones? That's exactly what I'll teach you in this video. Because when I learned about these 5 habits that all polyglots have in common, I rapidly sped up my progress. And if you start applying it to your learning as well, then you reach fluency in no time. The first habit is something that's very underrated, and it's all about the way you perceive language learning. When most people hear language learning, their brains automatically goes to textbooks, apps, and language classes. Things like grammar, vocabulary, and speaking seem to all be the commonly agreed upon ways of reaching fluency. After all, if you don't understand something, you simply have to learn it. I mean, surely, the way of understanding a sentence you don't yet know the meaning of is by looking up every single word in that sentence, writing them down, and then speaking them out loud a few times. Or is it? See, in my mind, there's a very big problem with this common approach. And that's the focus on thinking when it comes to learning a language. Looking back at how I learned my first foreign language, in my case English, I essentially did no thinking at all. I simply let my natural interest guide me towards whatever I found interesting in the moment. And as someone who grew up playing a lot of video games, for me this was watching many Let's Play videos of my favorite games in English. And that let me naturally acquire the language without really worrying too much about all the details. And this is something that I see practically every successful polyglot have in common, that the average learner is almost always struggling with. The reason having this mindset is so important is because not all ways of study are equal, and everyone who's learned a language to a high level intuitively knows this. While they all can help and provide some kind of benefit, no one has ever gotten fluent from just thinking their way to it. Now, this isn't to say that your brain shouldn't be engaged at all when learning. I think it should, but a language learning method based only on explicit learning activities is guaranteed to produce unnatural results, as that's not the way anyone has learned a language, including their native ones. So instead of trying to think our way to fluency, there's actually one approach we see time and time again effortlessly teaching people languages. And that brings us to habit number 2. What sets successful language learners apart is that they don't usually just see themselves as learners of the language. They instead see themselves as speakers of the language. This means that they don't just learn the technicalities of a language, but rather the culture and everything around it as well. They don't just learn from grammar books, but they rather do things like a native speaker would do it, such as watching TV in the language, listening to music, watching YouTube videos, and so on. Acting as if you were already a native speaker of the language is really key to acquiring the language naturally. And for the best possible results, you ideally want to get to the spot where, when you sit down to watch a piece of media, it's a pretty common occurrence that you pick something in your target language instead of in your native one. Now, this is practically the only reason why I was already fluent in English by the age of 10 or 11 years old, way before even visiting my first English-speaking country. I simply made English a big part of my identity. All my favorite YouTubers were in English, the favorite music I listened to was in English, the TV shows I listened to were in English, video games I played were in English, and so on. Now, by no means am I saying this is easy, but the reality is that everyone who successfully got into a high level in a language have either been or are living this way. And of course, this can also be quite painful sometimes. After all, we're used to understanding pretty much everything that's being said to us. So watching a piece of content and then not getting 20%, 30%, even 50%, that can be quite annoying. But this is when your mindset of already being a native speaker of the language really comes into play. You simply have to keep pushing, and almost act as if you already understand the stuff that you really don't understand. It's almost like you're deluding yourself into thinking that you're already fluent way before you are, because that's the only way you're gonna get there. Everyone who's learned a language to a high level have been in this position at one point. And that's where they either have to make the choice of giving up, turning on the good old English subtitles and going back to the comfortable textbook, or continuing, embracing the ambiguity of their learning and letting their brain slowly accustom itself to the language, until it felt natural. Now, there's a key thing that actually separates the people who can continue and proceed and get their desired results versus the ones who give up and stop making progress altogether. And that brings us to the third habit of successful language learners. I mentioned earlier that the people who successfully learn languages simply embrace the ambiguity and keep going even when things are hard, while the others freak out and go back to more familiar ways of study. So can you see the big difference in approach here? One type of learner does a complete 180 at the first sign of some slight resistance, while the other know things take time, and they're fine with that. Sure, it might feel uncomfortable at some point, but they ultimately have the confidence that everything's gonna work out in the end, so they just keep pushing no matter what. And this all comes down to having realistic expectations and not rushing the process. The way polyglots tend to learn is in consistent bouts of systematic effort. They know things take time, and they're cool with that. Because ultimately, the only way of continual progress is to keep doing the things that work no matter what. I mean, in a sense you could say that to keep learning, you pretty much have to think of yourself as a robot. Even though you encounter some slight resistance, you just have to keep going and moving forward no matter what, not stopping for anything. I mean, really ask yourself this. What is the purpose of worrying about you not understanding something, when the habits you're applying are things that have gotten billions of people across the world fluent in a bunch of languages already? And on the topic of worrying, there's something everyone seems to worry about regarding language learning, that I think is completely pointless. And that brings us to habit number 4. Now, I previously said that billions of people have already gotten fluent by simply spending time with the language and letting their brain do so. But everyone seems to have forgotten about how this process actually works. You get fluent in your native language from hearing it all day, every day, for over a year, until you finally spoke for the first time. This allowed for a final result of perfect understanding of the language, and a non-existent accent. But in spite of this, you're worried that if you don't speak from day one when it comes to learning a foreign language, you'll simply just not learn the skill of it. Please explain to me how that is. A common thing I see among successful language learners is that speaking is very low on their hierarchy of learning activities, at least in the beginning. They usually don't stress about speaking, because they know that with enough time spent consuming the language, they'll naturally pick up things along the way. And then when it's finally time to start having conversation, just a little bit of practice will usually do the trick and let them speak pretty naturally. Now, a common thing I hear regarding this is people saying stuff along the lines of, "I can understand more than I can speak." And the reality with that is that these people can usually not understand anything. They can understand some phrases and maybe some common words, but when it comes to understanding native speech, if they were to put on a TV show or a YouTube video, they're pretty much lost. And so to them, understanding certain phrases means understanding stuff. But when I'm talking about understanding, I'm saying that you can put on a Netflix show and understand pretty much everything that's being said. And once you get to that point, speaking will really not be a problem, trust me on that. Because the problem with focusing too much on speaking in the beginning stages of learning a language is that humans really don't acquire a language in this way. Something I'll talk more about on the card above in this video. But simply put, we acquire languages when we understand messages in it. Which is why you almost need to act like you're already a native speaker of the language, letting your brain build up this mental database of sorts. If you don't already have a base understanding of the language, then speaking really won't do you any good, since you'll just be making errors, trying to create sentences and failing to get your point across. When you instead could be spending your time consuming more of the language, waiting with speaking, and making it so that when you actually start speaking, you'll already be half decent at it. Now, it's not that speaking is this horrible sin that will ruin all your language learning progress. In fact, I do think it can teach you some things. It's just that most people have it way too high on their priority list, not realizing that what speaking gives you is just half of what actually listening to the language gives you. So although speaking is a productive use of your time, you're only really learning things when the other person is speaking, which is half of the time. So why not just put on a TV show instead and learn 90% of the time? The actual skill of speaking and uttering the sounds that make up a language is something you learn very quickly once you can comfortably comprehend it. And trying to rush that process will end up in ingraining poor pronunciation habits and ensuring the development of an unnatural accent. Now, about ensuring things. What separates the unsuccessful from the successful language learners is that the latter ensures progress, while the former just hopes for it. And that brings us to the 5th habit. If I could only bring up one common thing I see in unsuccessful language learners, it would have to be their wishy-washy approach to learning. Almost never do I hear about someone who has a proper plan they're consistently executing day in and day out, but they aren't making progress. The people who struggle learning languages always tend to say things like, "Oh yeah, I use apps sometimes when I have some time over," or "I used to take language learning classes in the past, but I stopped for whatever BS reason they have." Now, the common denominator here is that they don't actually have a process. They're just walking around hoping for progress, while the successful language learners have an actual plan they're following and executing day by day. So let me ask you this. Who do you think is the most successful type of language learner, and what do they do? Now, your answer might not be what I'm thinking about here, but I think I'm correct here. I mean, I usually am. But my answer is kids. Practically every kid across the world have learned at least one language to fluency, and I've never seen them take breaks from learning. They just lie around all day, listening to whatever it is the people around them are saying. And then they grow up and do the same thing in school, but seated. Now, in this regard, progress is pretty much certain for them, as they have no choice but to learn. So, I'm not telling you to go out and buy a crib to lie in all day, although that would probably work better than most language learning methods out there. But rather that you find a way of ensuring you stay on track, regularly doing the things that ensure success. Because it doesn't really matter if you do the best things possible if you only do them once or twice a week. It's simply not enough time to get anywhere meaningful with the language. But exactly how do you set up a language learning plan that guarantees success? Well, that's exactly what I talk about on the video on screen right now. So check it out, and I'll see you guys there.